Okay. I'm going to ask a question here. Ms. MacDonald, you and I haven't been able to discuss this yet today. The right to a healthy environment. I'm going to just read this here. Bill S-5 seeks to amend SEPA to recognize the right of every individual in Canada to a healthy environment. The bill requires the Minister of the Environment and the Minister of Health to develop an implementation framework within 2 years that would set out how this right will be considered in the administration of the Act. The ministers would be required to include in the framework more information on how the right would be balanced with social, economic, health, scientific, and other relevant factors. All these things coming into one definition. One thing we always lack when we do this is the precision around what these definitions are and the right to a healthy environment. And we do talk about the importance of health in Canada and the importance of health outcomes, mortality and morbidity being the most prevalent measurements we have on this that continue to improve in Canada. Given that if we're going to leave this open for some kind of interpretation that isn't in Parliament, which is our job here, in my opinion, to get precision on this, and it's going to be left open to the courts, are we opening up a 10-year process in the courts of trying to find out what definitions of such things as healthy environment and how those balance against social and economic and science and other relevant factors? Is that something that we need to consider in the mix here as far as getting it nailed down ahead of time?
We actually would prefer the right to just be stated as a right to healthy environment without the inclusion of those consideration of those factors. We understand the government wants to leave that in, and I think it is exactly because of your concern about potential litigation, so that they have, they can balance out the right against other things. But we are concerned that by including factors and so on, you can undermine the right. But I think in terms of defining the right, we've looked at legislation throughout Canada. There's, the right is there is legislation in Quebec, Ontario, Yukon, Northwest Territories that recognize different forms of the right to healthy environment, and none of them have defined the right.
So yes, if nobody's defined the right and it's in front of the courts repeatedly, are we not leaving it open to somebody's interpretation of what this means? And let me give you what I think is an example, although I'm making it up on the fly. When people live in cities, they forego certain health benefits of living in the country because they actually have other benefits that contribute to their life as well. And everybody makes these trade-offs on a daily basis. Everything we do is a choice or choices that we make to do what we think makes our life better when we have those choices. Given that some of these choices are going to require progress on so many issues. Some of that progress is going to require new chemicals that actually will lead to a more fulfilling life for 99.9% of Canadians, for instance. Does that necessarily put the 0.1% of Canadians in a position in the court where they can say this leads to a worse outcome for society because a small percentage of us are affected badly by this?
When SEPA regulates chemicals, it doesn't do it writ large for all the uses of the chemicals across the country. It focuses it on the risk. That's why it's a risk-driven piece of legislation. So if it's going to regulate a new chemical because of a risk, it might only be one aspect of how that chemical is used. So
yeah, we're not talking about SEPA here. We're talking about the definition of a healthy environment and how it applies in a legal perspective.
Well, you were giving me an example of a chemical, so I was trying to respond in terms of how it works. I will point you to the language in the bill actually does say subject to any reasonable limits, which is really how a court would interpret the right anyway. So that is written into the legislation that does recognize that the right is not that there are limits to any right, including the right to healthy environment, and that is right in the duty section of Bill S-5.